The treehouse stood deep in the woods, weathered and forgotten, shrouded by ancient oaks with branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. It was a relic from another time, a splintered monument to youthful innocence, and it bore a story whispered among locals as a chilling warning. No one remembered who built it. Some said it had been there for over a century, while others insisted it was a relic from the 1950s, constructed by a father for his son who mysteriously vanished. What all stories agreed upon was that the treehouse was cursed, a trap for those who dared climb its rickety ladder. Amy and her friends didn't believe in curses. It was the summer before college, and they were hungry for adventure. The tales of the hanging treehouse were too ridiculous to take seriously. But it was the way Mark dared her to go inside, the laughter in his voice, that sealed her fate. "Come on, Amy," Mark teased, "unless you're scared." The group huddled at the base of the tree, their flashlights casting long shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally. Amy squared her shoulders, hiding her hesitation. "I'm not scared," she replied, her voice firm. The ladder groaned under her weight, each rung slick with moss and damp from the evening dew. As she climbed, a chill crawled up her spine. The air felt heavier with each step, as if the forest were holding its breath. She reached the platform and pulled herself inside. The treehouse was eerily silent, its wooden walls etched with carvings, names, dates, and cryptic symbols she didn't recognize. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. She swept her flashlight across the room and froze. In the corner was a child's rocking chair, its paint chipped and peeling. It creaked back and forth, though there was no breeze. "See anything cool?" Mark called from below, his voice distant, as though the treehouse had swallowed sound itself. "Just a bunch of junk," Amy lied, her throat dry, but as she turned to leave, her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. She cursed, smacking the flashlight against her palm, but it remained stubbornly dark. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The voice was close, intimate, brushing against her ear. "Stay." Amy's heart thudded painfully as she scrambled for the ladder. Her hands fumbled in the dark, finding the top rung just as something cold and sharp grazed her ankle. She screamed and nearly lost her grip, but managed to descend in a frantic rush, her friends laughing nervously below. "Very funny, Amy," Mark said. "You almost had me convinced." Amy couldn't speak. She hit the ground running, ignoring their protests, her legs carrying her away from the cursed treehouse and the unexplainable dread clawing at her chest. She didn't stop until she was back at the campsite, the firelight a weak comfort against the encroaching darkness. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her ankle throbbed where she'd felt the icy touch, and when she finally worked up the courage to look, she found 3 thin scratches, perfectly parallel, like the marks of a claw. Her friends dismissed it as her imagination, a scrape from an old nail, but Amy knew better. Something had been up there with her. The next day, Mark insisted on going back. "We need pictures," he said, "proof that it's just an old treehouse." Amy refused to go, so the group set off without her. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. When the others didn't return, Amy's unease turned to panic. She grabbed a flashlight and set out alone, her footsteps crunching on the forest floor. She found them beneath the tree, their bodies pale and still. At first, she thought they were playing a cruel joke, but when she shook Mark's shoulder, his head lolled unnaturally to the side, his eyes wide and unseeing. Amy stumbled back, her scream lost in the suffocating stillness. That's when she noticed the marks on the ground, a trail of disturbed leaves leading away from the treehouse, as though something had dragged them there. She didn't follow the trail. She ran, her flashlight flickering as shadows seemed to dance just beyond its beam. When she reached the edge of the woods, she collapsed in exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The authorities found no sign of her friends. The bodies she'd seen were gone, the area beneath the tree undisturbed save for her footprints. They ruled it a prank gone wrong, a case of teenagers running away, and Amy was left with only her scars on her ankle and her mind. Years passed, but the memory of that night never left her. She moved away far from the cursed woods, but the whispers followed. At first they came in dreams, soft and insistent. Then she began hearing them in waking moments, a faint murmur beneath the hum of everyday life. "Stay," they whispered, their voices growing louder, more insistent. One night, unable to bear the torment, Amy returned. The forest greeted her like an old friend, its shadows welcoming her into their embrace. The treehouse loomed above, unchanged, waiting. As she climbed the ladder for the second time in her life, the whispers swelled into a cacophony, a symphony of despair and longing. The air inside was thick with malice, and the rocking chair sat in the corner, its creak a metronome to her fear. Amy sat down, her body trembling, her mind numb. She barely noticed as the chair began to move, its rhythm soothing, almost hypnotic. The whispers faded, replaced by a silence that felt almost kind. When searchers found the treehouse weeks later, they discovered it empty, save for the rocking chair, now still and dust-covered. Amy's friends were never found, and neither was she. But on quiet nights, beneath the ancient oaks, locals say you can hear laughter, a child's laughter, and the soft creak of a rocking chair moving in time with the wind.
Story number 2.
The locals called it the Grinning Well. Hidden deep in the forest, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, it had been abandoned for decades. The well's stones were blackened with age, its wooden cover splintered and rotting. Children whispered about it at sleepovers, daring each other to visit, but few ever did. Those who returned spoke of strange noises and shadows that didn't match the light. Ellie had heard all the stories, but Ellie didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She was a skeptic, fascinated by the supernatural only because it gave her something to disprove. So, when her friends dared her to spend a night near the well, she agreed without hesitation. "You're going to regret it," warned her best friend Mia as they hiked through the forest. "People say it laughs at you, Ellie, that it sees you." Ellie rolled her eyes. "It's just a hole in the ground. I'll be fine." The others wouldn't stay. They dropped her off with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and enough snacks to last until morning. They promised to pick her up at dawn, though their nervous glances betrayed their relief at leaving the place behind. Alone, Ellie set up camp a few feet from the well. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. The well loomed in the center of the clearing, its jagged stones forming a grim mouth, as though the earth itself were grinning at her. Ellie shivered but dismissed the feeling. She unpacked her things, sat down with her flashlight, and waited. Time dragged on, the hours marked only by the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional breeze. She grew bored, then sleepy, her eyelids drooping despite her efforts to stay awake. Around midnight, the first sound came, a faint chuckle, low and raspy, like someone laughing just out of sight. Ellie froze, her heart pounding. The laugh came again, louder this time, and unmistakably from the well. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. She hated how scared she sounded. The laughter stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. Ellie gripped her flashlight, aiming it at the well. The beam barely penetrated the darkness inside. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of her tired mind. Then she heard it again, a laugh, closer now, echoing unnaturally in the still night. It wasn't a human laugh. It was deeper, guttural, as though the well itself were mocking her. Her legs shook as she approached, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She leaned over the edge, peering into the abyss. The beam of light barely scratched the surface of the darkness below. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Two eyes opened in the blackness, glowing faintly red. They stared back at her, unblinking, and then a wide, toothy grin appeared beneath them, impossibly large and shimmering white against the void. Ellie stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. The laughter erupted again, louder, echoing around her, surrounding her. It wasn't coming from the well anymore, it was everywhere. She spun in circles, the flashlight flickering, the shadows around her growing taller, more defined. Faces began to form in the trees, mouths stretched in grotesque grins, eyes hollow and watching. Ellie tried to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The forest warped, the trees closing in, their twisted branches clawing at her. The laughter followed, relentless, a cacophony of mockery and malice. She tripped and fell, landing hard on her back. The flashlight rolled away, its beam pointing uselessly at the sky. She scrambled to her knees, crawling toward the well, as if it could somehow protect her. But the well had changed. The stones pulsed as though alive, the grin wider now, its teeth glistening. The red eyes rose from its depths, the figure attached to them emerging slowly. Its body was impossibly long and thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It wore a face stretched into an eternal smile, its teeth too many and too sharp. Ellie couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The creature reached for her, its spindly fingers cold as death. It tilted its head, the grin never wavering, and whispered, "Why are you leaving so soon? The fun's just begun." She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. The creature dragged her toward the well, its laughter mingling with hers until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The last thing Ellie saw was the darkness of the well, yawning wide to consume her. When her friends arrived the next morning, Ellie was gone. The clearing was undisturbed, the well as silent and still as it had always been. But her flashlight lay at the edge, its beam still on, pointing into the abyss. And if they had leaned closer, they might have heard the faintest echo of laughter rising from its depths, accompanied by the soft, mocking whisper of a voice. "Stay."
Story number 3.
The cabin had been abandoned for decades. Perched on the edge of Blackthorn Lake, its warped wooden beams sagged under the weight of years, its windows broken and smeared with grime. Locals avoided it, claiming the place was cursed. Fishermen spoke of strange sounds drifting across the water at night, and hikers reported cold spots that lingered too long, even in the heat of summer. But to Emily and Jake, the cabin was just an old building, the perfect setting for a weekend of ghost stories and urban exploration. It was Emily's idea to film the trip, to capture any paranormal activity for her growing online audience. Jake, ever the skeptic, tagged along, more interested in debunking the myths than indulging them. They arrived late in the afternoon, the lake a sheet of glass reflecting the crimson sky. The cabin looked worse up close. The door hung ajar, its rusted hinges barely holding it in place. The surrounding forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the animals were avoiding the place as much as the locals did. "This is perfect," Emily said, her camera already rolling. "Creepy old cabin, spooky lake. It's exactly what my followers want." Jake snorted. "Your followers want a show. Let's give them one." Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something sharper, metallic. The cabin's furniture was still there, an overturned table, a couch covered in tattered sheets, and a rocking chair that faced the lake. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and spider webs hung like curtains from the corners. Emily panned the camera around the room, narrating as she went. "This place is exactly how they described it. Cold, eerie, and absolutely terrifying." Jake wandered off, poking at the walls with a stick. "It's just an old house. People probably made up the stories to keep kids away." But as the sun set and the shadows deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and an unnatural chill settled over the cabin. Emily wrapped herself in a blanket as she set up the camera on a tripod, pointing it toward the lake. "We'll leave it running overnight," she said. "See if it catches anything." Jake rolled his eyes but didn't argue. They ate in silence, the only sound the occasional creak of the cabin settling. When they finally turned in, Emily left the camera recording, its tiny red light a beacon in the darkness. The first noise came just after midnight, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on wood. Emily woke first, sitting up and straining to listen. It was coming from the direction of the lake. "Jake," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, but sat up, his annoyance fading as the tapping grew louder. It wasn't just tapping now. It was accompanied by a faint, wet squelching, as if something was dragging itself across the ground. Emily grabbed the camera and pointed it at the window. The lake was shrouded in mist, the moonlight reflecting off its surface. For a moment there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. Then a shadow moved across the water. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and spindly. It walked with a jerky, unsteady gait, its head tilting at impossible angles. The tapping grew louder as it approached, the sound coming from its unnervingly long fingers, which it wrapped against the cabin's wooden walls. Jake cursed under his breath. "What the hell is that?" Emily kept the camera trained on the figure, her hands shaking. "I don't know. Maybe it's someone playing a prank?" But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The thing moved closer, its head snapping toward the cabin. 2 pinpricks of light shone where its eyes should have been, and its mouth stretched into a wide, toothy grin. The tapping stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. Emily and Jake barely dared to breathe. The figure stood motionless outside the window, its grin visible even through the fogged glass. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and knocked, once, twice, 3 times, on the window. Emily screamed. Jake grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he yanked, the door remained stubbornly closed, as though held in place by an unseen force. The knocking grew more insistent, the glass rattling in its frame. Emily turned the camera toward the window just as the figure pressed its face against the glass. Its skin was pale and glistening, stretched too tight over its skull. Its grin was wider now, its teeth impossibly sharp. And then it whispered, "Let me in." The voice was low and guttural, vibrating through the cabin like the growl of some ancient predator. The window began to crack, thin lines spidering out from where its claws scraped the glass. Jake grabbed a chair and swung it at the window. The glass shattered outward, and for a moment the creature was gone, the mist outside swallowing it whole. "Run!" Jake shouted, pulling Emily toward the broken window. They scrambled out into the cold night, the air thick with the stench of rot. The forest seemed alive around them, the trees twisting and groaning as they ran. Behind them, the cabin creaked, and a guttural laugh echoed from its depths. They didn't stop until they reached their car, gasping for breath as Jake fumbled with the keys. As the engine roared to life, Emily glanced back toward the cabin. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching them. Its grin was wider now, impossibly so, stretching beyond the limits of its face. And as they sped away, Emily realized the camera was still in the cabin, its red light blinking in the darkness. When they returned with the police the next morning, the cabin was empty. The camera was gone, and so was any trace of their terrifying encounter. But later that night, as Emily scrolled through her phone, she found a video she hadn't recorded. The footage was shaky, filmed from within the cabin, the lens trained on the lake, and in the final frame, just before the screen went black, was the figure's face, grinning wide, its mouth whispering 2 chilling words. "Thank you."
Story number 4.
The road to Hollow Creek was rarely traveled. It wound through dense, overgrown woods, the canopy above so thick it seemed to steal the sunlight even at midday. Locals called it Dead Man's Hollow, a grim name rooted in the countless accidents that had occurred along its treacherous bends. Cars would slide off the road, their drivers vanishing without a trace. Search parties found only wreckage, their headlights eerily extinguished as if swallowed by the forest itself. Lila had heard the stories her whole life. As a child, her grandfather would tell her about the road's ghostly hitchhiker, a woman in a tattered dress who appeared at the edge of the forest, asking for a ride before vanishing into thin air. Lila never believed him. She chalked it up to local folklore, a tale meant to scare children. But that was before she found herself driving down Dead Man's Hollow one cold, moonless night. Her car had broken down earlier that evening, and the tow truck never showed. Frustrated, she borrowed her mother's ancient station wagon, a clunky relic from the 1980s with a flickering radio and a heater that barely worked. The road was her only shortcut home, and she was eager to get back before the storm brewing on the horizon hit. The drive started uneventfully. The woods pressed in on either side, the trees bare and skeletal in the cold winter air. Her headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional animal darting across her path. She turned up the radio to drown out the unnerving quiet, but the static only made her feel more alone. As she rounded a sharp curve, her headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road. A woman. She wore a white dress, its hem frayed and muddied, and her long, dark hair obscured her face. She stood motionless, one hand raised in a pleading gesture. Lila's stomach twisted. Her grandfather's story came rushing back, but she shook it off. This was real life, not some ghost story. Maybe the woman was lost, or her car had broken down. Against her better judgment, Lila slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" she called. The woman didn't move. Her face was still hidden by her hair, but her hand lowered, pointing toward the passenger seat. Lila hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to drive away, but guilt won out. She leaned over and unlocked the door. "Get in," she said. The woman slid into the seat without a word. Her presence filled the car with an icy chill, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Lila glanced at her passenger, trying to get a better look at her face, but the woman turned away, staring out the window. "Where are you headed?" Lila asked, forcing her voice to sound calm. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed straight ahead, down the dark road. "Okay, sure," Lila muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Her unease grew with each passing mile. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in like a tunnel. She checked the rearview mirror, but the forest behind her was swallowed in blackness. After a while, the woman spoke, her voice soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Turn left." Lila's pulse quickened. There hadn't been any turnoffs on the road that she could recall. But as she drove a few more feet, her headlights illuminated a narrow dirt path, veering off into the woods. "I don't think that's a real road," Lila said, her voice trembling. "Are you sure?" "Turn left," the woman repeated, her voice sharper now. Lila's hands shook as she obeyed, the station wagon bumping along the uneven path. The trees grew denser, their branches scraping against the car like fingernails on glass. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, and the cold intensified, seeping into Lila's bones. The woman spoke again. "Stop!" Lila slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt in a small clearing. The headlights illuminated a scene that made her stomach churn. A crumbling stone bridge spanning a narrow creek, its surface slick with moss. Beyond it, the path disappeared into total darkness. "I don't think this is a good idea," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to look at the woman, but the passenger seat was empty. Her breath caught in her throat. The door hadn't opened. There had been no sound of movement. Yet the woman was gone. Panic set in as Lila scrambled to shift the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died, leaving her in suffocating silence. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal, only the faint hum of static from the radio. Then she heard it, a soft splash like something moving in the creek. Lila froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The splash came again, closer this time. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and turned her gaze to the bridge. A figure stood in the middle of it. It was the woman, but something was different. Her hair was slick with water, hanging in tangled strands over her face. Her dress clung to her body, dripping as though she just crawled out of the creek. And then she lifted her head. Her face was pale and bloated, her eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, water spilling from between her teeth. "Thank you for bringing me home," she said, her voice gurgling with water. Lila screamed, her hands fumbling for the keys, but the ignition refused to turn. The woman stepped closer, her bare feet splashing in the creek, her grin widening as she reached for the car. The last thing Lila saw was the woman's hand pressing against the windshield, leaving a wet, dark smear. The car filled with the sound of rushing water, and then nothing. Days later, the station wagon was found abandoned on the side of Dead Man's Hollow. The engine was intact, the gas tank full, but the driver's seat was soaked, as though someone had dumped a bucket of water inside. Lila was never found. But those who drive the road at night swear they see her, standing at the edge of the forest, her hand raised in a silent plea for a ride.
Story number 5.
The old asylum on the outskirts of town had stood abandoned for decades, its towering spires and shattered windows casting jagged shadows against the night sky. Kids dared each other to sneak in, adults whispered warnings, and those who ventured too close claimed they felt watched. It was said that the asylum was alive, feeding on the despair of those who wandered within its crumbling walls. Mara had heard all the stories, but as an urban explorer and thrill-seeker, the asylum was a dream come true. She wanted photos, proof that the stories were nothing more than exaggerated campfire tales. Armed with her camera, flashlight, and a growing Instagram following, she set out one crisp October evening to uncover the truth. She entered through a broken side door, the wood rotted and hanging on its hinges. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and decay. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing long, empty hallways lined with rusted gurneys and peeling paint. The building seemed to groan around her, the sound of shifting beams and distant wind making her pause more than once. "This is incredible," she whispered, snapping pictures of graffiti-covered walls and shattered glass. "Creepy, sure, but nothing to be scared of." As she ventured deeper, the sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The air grew colder, and her breath became visible in the beam of her flashlight. She reached what must have been the central wing, where the hallways converged in a grand rotunda. In its center stood a rusted wheelchair, tilted slightly to one side. Mara approached, the floor creaking beneath her boots. She crouched to snap a photo of the wheelchair, adjusting her lens to capture the eerie atmosphere. But as she clicked the shutter, the sound of faint laughter echoed through the rotunda. She froze, her heart pounding. The laughter was high-pitched, childlike, but filled with something wrong. It came from behind her, down one of the hallways she'd just passed. Slowly, she turned her flashlight in that direction. The hallway was empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped, replaced by the soft sound of footsteps. They were light, like bare feet padding across the floor, and they were getting closer. Mara backed away, her flashlight flickering. I'm just here to take pictures," she stammered. "I'll leave if you want me to." The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, her own breathing loud in her ears. She swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching on nothing but empty hallways and broken furniture. Then the wheelchair moved. It rolled forward an inch, its wheels screeching against the tile. Mara gasped, stumbling backward. She didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was the wind or the uneven floor, or... It moved again, this time rolling toward her. Slowly, deliberately. She turned and ran, her boots pounding against the floor as she retraced her steps. The hallways seemed longer now, twisting and narrowing, the walls pressing in around her. She didn't remember taking so many turns, but she kept moving, refusing to look back. But the laughter returned, louder now, echoing all around her. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was several, men, women, children, all laughing in a discordant chorus that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her flashlight flickered again, and she smacked it desperately, the beam growing weaker with every passing second. Ahead, she saw a door slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. Relief flooded her chest. An exit. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the cold breath on the back of her neck, the invisible hands that seemed to brush against her arms. She burst through the door and into the light, slamming it shut behind her. She was in another room. This one was worse. The walls were covered in faded, water-stained murals of smiling faces, their eyes hollow and black. A long table dominated the center of the room, its surface littered with rusted medical tools and faded photographs of people who looked eerily familiar. Mara's flashlight finally died, plunging her into darkness. The laughter stopped, replaced by whispers. They came from all around her, overlapping and unintelligible, but one phrase cut through the cacophony, spoken clearly and directly into her ear. "You shouldn't have come," she screamed, backing against the wall, her hands fumbling for her phone. She turned on the flashlight app, its weak light illuminating the room, just enough for her to see the photographs more clearly. Her stomach dropped. The faces in the photos were hers, dozens of them, taken from different angles, in different places she'd explored. Some were from years ago, places she hadn't even remembered visiting. And in every single one, a shadowy figure loomed in the background, just out of focus. The door behind her creaked open. She turned slowly, the light from her phone barely piercing the darkness beyond. A figure stood in the doorway. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by shadows, but she could see its grin, wide and filled with too many teeth. The whispers grew louder, the walls seeming to close in as the figure stepped forward. Mara bolted for the opposite door, flinging it open and stumbling into the hallway. The building was no longer familiar. The walls bled, the floor squelched beneath her feet, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. The laughter returned, louder and more frenzied as unseen hands clawed at her hair and clothes. She didn't know how long she ran, but eventually she burst through a door and into the open air. The cold night was a welcome shock to her system, and she collapsed on the overgrown lawn, gasping for breath. When she looked back at the asylum, it was dark and silent, the windows like empty eyes staring at her. Her camera was gone, her flashlight too, and her phone showed nothing but static on the screen. The next day, when she told her story, no one believed her. The asylum, they said, had been demolished years ago, but Mara knew better, and every night since, when she looks into the dark corners of her home, she sees them. The shadows, watching, waiting, grinning.
Story number 6.
The old Peterson house was the kind of place that children dared each other to approach but never entered. Perched on the edge of a steep hill, it seemed to loom over the neighborhood like a predator stalking its prey. Its windows were dark and gaping, its roof sagging under the weight of years, and its yard overrun with weeds that swayed unnaturally in the slightest breeze. Most avoided it. But Mia couldn't resist. Mia was a budding paranormal investigator, or so she liked to think. Her YouTube channel, Haunt Hunters, was a small but growing venture where she explored supposedly haunted locations. The Peterson house, with its grim history and air of menace, was too tempting to pass up. The story went that the Peterson family had vanished one night without a trace. No signs of struggle, no bodies, just dinner left half-eaten on the table and the faint smell of sulfur in the air. Since then, the house had stood empty, a monument to unanswered questions. Mia arrived just before sunset, her gear in tow, a flashlight, an EMF detector, a handheld camera, and a digital recorder for capturing EVPs. She filmed her intro in front of the house, the setting sun casting long shadows over the porch. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most infamous mysteries in town, she said, her voice steady despite the chill creeping into her spine. The Peterson house? Will we find answers, or will we uncover something best left hidden? She pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The interior was just as eerie as the exterior. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped like curtains from the corners. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. Her flashlight beam revealed a living room frozen in time. An old armchair, a bookshelf filled with tattered novels, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a flame in decades. Mia set up her camera on a tripod, letting it record as she explored. She spoke into her recorder, asking the usual questions. Is anyone here? Can you tell me your name? What happened to the Peterson family? The house answered with silence. She moved into the kitchen, where plates still sat on the table, their contents long rotted away. Her EMF detector spiked suddenly, the green light flashing to yellow. She held her breath, scanning the room, but nothing moved. Okay, she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. If you're here, can you give me a sign? A single plate slid off the table and shattered on the floor. Mia jumped, her heart racing. Thank you, she said, though her voice wavered. Can you do that again? The house groaned in response, the sound deep and guttural like the building itself was exhaling. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the kitchen was plunged into darkness. When the light stabilized, she saw it. A shadow. Not cast by her or her equipment, but standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall and hunched, its edges blurred as if it wasn't fully part of this world. Its head tilted unnaturally as though observing her. Who are you? Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. The shadow didn't move. It simply dissolved, melting into the wall like smoke. Mia's instincts screamed at her to leave, but she pressed on. I have to document this, she muttered to herself, clutching her camera like a lifeline. She followed the EMF detector's spikes, which led her upstairs. The second floor was worse. The air was colder, thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. She entered what must have been the master bedroom, its furnishings untouched but coated in decades of dust. A mirror hung on the far wall, its surface warped and speckled with age. As she approached, the EMF detector went wild, its lights flashing red. She turned her camera toward the mirror, angling it to capture both the glass and her reflection. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, the reflection changed. In the mirror, the room was pristine, as though frozen in time. The bed was made, the curtains clean and drawn back to reveal a sunny day. And standing in the corner was the Peterson family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. They stared at her with wide, hollow eyes, their expressions frozen in identical masks of terror. The mother's mouth moved silently, forming words Mia couldn't hear. Then, one by one, they turned their heads to look directly at her. Mia stumbled back, her camera slipping from her hands. She didn't dare look at the mirror again. Instead, she grabbed her recorder and asked, "What happened to you?" Her recorder crackled with static. Then a voice, a deep, guttural growl, responded. "We never left." The door behind her slammed shut. The house groaned again, the walls seeming to shift and close in. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her flashlight flickered wildly, and the air grew colder still, her breath visible in the dim light. Then the voice came again, this time all around her. "You'll stay too. Something grabbed her arm, an icy skeletal grip that burned like frostbite. She screamed, twisting free and throwing herself against the door. It gave way suddenly, and she tumbled into the hallway. She didn't stop running. She bolted down the stairs, through the living room, and out the front door, leaving her gear behind. The night air hit her like a slap, and she didn't stop until she reached her car. When she finally looked back, the house stood silent and still. But in one of the darkened windows, she saw them, the Peterson family, watching, waiting. The next morning, Mia returned with the police, but her equipment was gone and the house looked untouched. They dismissed her story as the product of overactive imagination and stress. But Mia knew the truth, and every night since she dreams of the Peterson family. Their hollow eyes, their silent pleas, and the shadow that loomed behind them grinning.
Story number 7.
The train station at Ravenglen had been abandoned for over 50 years. Once a bustling hub for travelers had been shut down after a catastrophic accident. The story went that a train, traveling at full speed, derailed just before entering the station, plunging into the ravine below. Everyone aboard, passengers and crew alike, died instantly. The tracks were never repaired, the station condemned, and the town moved on. Except, people claimed, the train never truly stopped running. They called it the Midnight Ghost Train. Locals swore that on moonless nights, the whistle of the doomed locomotive could be heard echoing through the valley. Some said they'd seen its lights glowing faintly in the distance, cutting through the fog, only to vanish moments later. And a few, the brave or foolish, claimed they'd gone to the station and seen it up close. No one who saw the train ever came back the same. Danny didn't believe in ghosts. As a college student studying urban legends, he considered himself a skeptic. He was fascinated by the psychology behind hauntings, the way people convinced themselves of the supernatural. The Ravenglen Ghost Train was the perfect subject for his thesis, and he intended to debunk the myth once and for all. It was a foggy October night when Danny arrived at the derelict station. Armed with his camera, audio recorder, and a high-powered flashlight, he stepped onto the crumbling platform. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of rust and decay. The station was silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. "This is Danny Winslow, documenting the so-called Midnight Ghost Train," he said into his recorder, his voice steady despite the eerie surroundings. "As of now, there are no signs of paranormal activity, just an old station and a lot of fog." He walked along the platform, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick mist. The tracks below were rusted and overgrown with weeds, the wood of the ties rotting away. He set up his camera on a tripod, aiming it down the tracks where the train would have approached. For hours, nothing happened. Danny paced the platform, occasionally muttering observations into his recorder. Midnight came and went, and he felt a pang of disappointment. Just another empty legend, he thought. But then he heard it, a distant whistle, faint, mournful, and echoing through the valley. He froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint clatter of wheels on tracks. He grabbed his camera and pointed it down the line, but the fog was too thick to see anything. The whistle blared again, this time closer. The ground beneath him trembled as the sound of the train grew deafening. Lights pierced the fog, two glowing orbs like eyes, and the air grew thick with the acrid smell of coal smoke. Danny's rational mind screamed that it was impossible. There were no functioning tracks, no trains in the area for decades. And yet, he saw it. The train emerged from the fog, a hulking black locomotive with a gleaming steel front. Its windows were dark, but shadows moved within, faint outlines of passengers sitting unnaturally still. The wheels spun, but they made no contact with the tracks, hovering inches above the ground. Danny's camera captured it all, his hands trembling as he recorded. The train slowed as it approached the station, coming to a stop directly in front of him. The door to the nearest car creaked open, and the faint hiss of steam filled the air. He stood frozen, unsure whether to run or stay. Then, a figure stepped off the train. It was a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his cap tilted low over his face. His posture was stiff, and as he turned to face Danny, the flashlight illuminated his features, or lack thereof. The conductor had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. He raised a gloved hand and gestured for Danny to board the train. Every instinct told Danny to run, but his legs felt like lead. Slowly, as though in a trance, he stepped toward the open door. The conductor stood motionless, his hands still raised. As Danny reached the threshold, he caught a glimpse inside the car. The passengers sat eerily still, their faces pale and gaunt. Their eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. He staggered back, breaking free from the trance. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm not getting on." The conductor tilted his head as if puzzled and stepped closer. His hand reached out, cold and clammy, and Danny felt his vision blur. The air around him grew heavy, the sound of the train's engine drowning out his thoughts. Desperate, he grabbed his camera and threw it at the conductor. The device passed straight through him, shattering on the ground. The conductor froze, then stepped back onto the train. The whistle blared once more, and the door slammed shut. The train began to move, its wheels spinning without touching the ground, and it disappeared into the fog as suddenly as it had appeared. Danny stood alone on the platform, his heart racing. His camera was destroyed, and his recorder had fallen silent, the screen cracked and unresponsive. The only evidence of what he'd seen was the faint imprint of coal dust on his hands. He left the station that night, vowing never to return. Danny finished his thesis, but it didn't include the story of the midnight ghost train. He tried to convince himself it was a hallucination, a trick of the fog and his own imagination. But late at night, when the world was quiet, he could still hear the whistle echoing in his mind. And sometimes when he closed his eyes, he dreamed of the conductor's faceless grin.